Hey everybody, I'm Tim, and this is Off the Milk. So today we're just going to jump straight into the book of Ezekiel, specifically chapter 8 and most of chapter 9. And what's going on here is Ezekiel was a prophet, and he's having a vision. Basically, what happens is Ezekiel goes into the temple of the Lord, and he sees all of the terrible things that the Israelites are doing. And it starts like this. So in Ezekiel's vision, he's taken into the temple courtyard, specifically the north gate, and God says, look to the north, and he does, and there's this very large engraved image that people are worshiping. And so the thing is, like, people are worshiping an idol in the Lord's temple. Now, specifically, a lot of people think that this idol was actually a carved image of Asherah, and it was facing north, basically to ask for protection from Israel's enemies. So people were worshiping an idol, and this was, I believe, a Canaanite custom, an idol of Asherah, asking for protection, not having any sort of faith that God is their protector. And then God basically tells Ezekiel, hold on, it gets worse. He tells Ezekiel to carve a hole into the inner wall and see what's going on there. So Ezekiel does, and he finds himself in this sort of secret chamber where there are 70 leaders of Israel worshiping just drawings of animals. And this was sort of like an Egyptian cultural thing to do. And they're doing it in private. They're hiding themselves, saying no one's going to see us in here. But these are still the leaders of Israel. These are the people who are supposed to be leading God's people. And again, God says, hold on, it gets worse. He takes Ezekiel back into the courtyard of the temple, where he sees a bunch of women mourning the death of god Tammuz. And this was actually sort of like a Babylonian cultural thing to do, where they believed that Tammuz was a god who died and went into the underworld, and he had to sort of like regenerate there before he could come back up, and the cycle flowed with the natural cycles of life, and it would be like this ritualistic mourning that women would do to sort of speed fertility of life again. We have, just so far, we have people adhering to a Canaanite culture, turning their backs on God, saying, God's not going to protect us, but this hunk of wood will. And then we have the leaders of Israel practicing an Egyptian religion, saying, no one can see us here. We're going to worship these animals. And then we have these women practicing Babylonian religion. They're doing a ritualistic mourning for the death of a false god in the Lord's temple, instead of worshiping the living and true God. And every single time God goes, hold on, it gets worse than this. Hold on, it gets worse than this. Hold on, it gets worse with this. And then he takes them into the inner sanctum, before the altar of the Lord, as far in as a priest could go without being the high priest, the closest to God's tabernacle, where God's presence was concentrated on earth. As close as you could get with that, without actually entering into the Holy of Holies, before the altar. There are priests who have their back turned to the sanctuary, who have their back turned to God's presence so they can instead bow down and worship the sun. It breaks God's heart to see all of this going on. There's no word for the jealousy, for the anger that God's feeling. His people have completely turned his back on him. They're crying out, God's not here. God can't hear us. God isn't listening to us. So God continues the vision. And it's here that he calls the men forward, appointed to destroy the city. These are like sort of angelic beings, but they have the form of men. And 6 men step forward. The New King James Version says each of them are carrying a battle axe. These are just men who are here to slaughter and to destroy. But there's one more person who steps forward. The 7th man. There's a 7th man who steps forward. And the 7th man is different from all of the other 6 men. He's different from everyone who's come before him. The Bible doesn't say really anything about the 7th man. It doesn't say that there's really much significant about him. It doesn't say that he had this glorious appearance. It doesn't say that he was this wonderful shining light. It was just a 7th man, looking rather ordinary, rather average. And really the only difference about him is he was wearing linen. Really the only difference about him is he didn't have a weapon. The only difference about him is he instead carried a writer's inkhorn. Now, linen's important here because, well, first off, it's not so wonderful of a garment. It's not so magnanimous. The translation here would actually be white linen, and actually it would be really close to the garments that a high priest would wear actually in the temple of the Lord. And so he was wearing this white linen. It's rather plain. He was carrying a writer's inkhorn, not for death, but to create a mark. And it's actually what God tells this 7th man to do that I want to focus on today. Because everybody who came before this 7th man came here to kill and destroy and conquer. But it's the 7th man that God said, put a mark upon the head of everyone who is faithful to me. Put a mark upon the head of everyone who weeps and mourns about all of these terrible things that my people are doing. Put a mark on their head. And he tells the 6 men, go out and kill, but don't touch anyone who has this mark on their head. And actually, in Hebrew, the word that's used for mark, place a mark upon your head, that word mark is tav. Now, tav is actually a letter as well. Tav happens to be the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and as such, it has these sort of connotations of completeness, of wholeness, of perfection, of rounding out. But really, if you look into it, tav literally means mark. It means a sign, a signature, a seal. Like if you were writing a letter and you had to sort of stamp a seal, stamp it shut, pour wax over the envelope and stamp it shut, you would put your signature, you would put your seal, you would put your sign on it. And that would mean it was from you. And that's what tav is. It also means a promise, because it's sort of like the promise that God gave to these people with the mark, that they wouldn't be touched, that they would live. Think of it like at the bottom of a contract. You read through the contract and then you would sign by the X to agree to the contract, sign, like you agree to these terms, that these terms are your promise that you will fulfill, and your signature is sort of the sign that you will fulfill these promises. That's pretty much exactly what tav is. We have this tav, and about this time period, actually, tav looked like this. And it sort of makes you pause, and it makes you wonder, wait a second, just who is this 7th man? And you think about it, 7 is the number of completion, isn't it? Like 7 is the number of perfection, of wholeness. It's the 7th man who's supposed to bring this completion. It's the 7th man who seeks not destruction but salvation. It's the 7th man who looks for a way to save people. It's the 7th man who's God's servant, whose entire purpose is for salvation. Because when destruction is owed, it's the 7th man who comes in and says, salvation. And the mark that he puts on the head of his people to mark them as salvation, tav. Actually, you can spell letters in Hebrew. Did you know you can spell letters in Hebrew using other letters? And it just so happens that tav is spelled tav vav. Now we talked about tav, so let's focus on vav. Vav is actually a picture of a nail. And so this word that's used here in Ezekiel 9, verse 4, put a mark upon the heads of the people who are faithful to me. This tav, spelt this sign of salvation, this mark, this promise of salvation when destruction is owed. It's spelt out with a cross and a nail. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 19, this is God talking, and what the verse says is, I publicly proclaim bold promises. I do not whisper obscurities in some dark corner. I would not have told the people of Israel to seek me out if I could not be found. I, the Lord, say only what is true, and I declare only what is right. And I think a lot of times we sort of forget just who God is. He's the God who publicly proclaims bold promises, who went through the effort to show sign after sign after sign after promise after promise after promise, and every single one of them points to his plan for salvation for me, for you, when I don't deserve it. He doesn't whisper obscurities in some dark corner. He's not just in your head. He's not just a tiny voice that does tiny things that later on says, see, I told you so. Man, he's the God who challenges us to seek him out, who challenges us, say, hey, look for me. I dare you because I know you're going to find me. Or rather, that he'll find us because, he's not the one who's lost. And without fail, he finds us. Without fail, he meets us where we are, no matter what we're going through in life, no matter what we just did, no matter how badly we need him, no matter how badly we think we don't need him. Look for him and he'll meet you. Look for him and he'll come down to you. He'll look you in the eye. He'll grab your heart and he'll lift you up out of that. Because that's who God is. He's the God who seeks a way for salvation. It's in his name. We think about it, and the best way that we know how to pronounce God's name is Yahweh, and it's spelled Yud-He, Vav-He. The best translation that we could think about to English of God's name is the I am, Yud-He, Vav-He. You take those last couple letters, He, Vav-He, and actually in Hebrew it's another word, and it means to exist. That Yud, it's a picture of an arm, it's a picture of a hand, and it has connotations of creation, to make, to create. So the picture behind God's name is the one who created existence, or the self-existent. He doesn't need anything else to exist because he created everything that does exist. That's who God is, the I am. And I need you to hear me out on this, because it's not the I was. And it's not the I will be, it's the I am. It's not the I set things into motion, now you're off on your own. It's not the I'm coming at the end to judge you all and kill you all because I'm gone. It's the I am. Because God's promise, God's ultimate promise of salvation, God's ultimate promise of who he is, God's ultimate plan for you is that he will be there for you. This is what God's saying. In your weakness, I am your strength. In your brokenness, I am that which heals you. And in your incompleteness, I am that which makes you whole again. That's what the cross was. Because God came to a people who were broken, who came to a people who deserved death, who came to a people who were constantly turning their backs to him, constantly turning their backs to everything that was good, constantly turning their backs on the way that they should live, on the way that God wants them to live, constantly being cruel to each other, constantly killing each other, constantly hurting each other. And he came down and he said, don't you know who I am? Don't you know what I want for you? Don't you know how much I love you? See, we worship a God who says, I am. here. And he proved it. He proved it on the cross. He proved that he would rather die than have heaven without you. He proved that no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, love is stronger. Love is stronger. And he did it by giving his life for you. And now that same power that rose Christ from the dead is alive inside of me. That same power that beat death, that beat sin, that beat shame is alive inside of me. And I was dead to rights. That's who I was. I was dead to sin. I had no hope. I had no way. But it's God's Holy Spirit alive inside of me that rose me from death into life. It's what Jesus did on the cross that has healed me. And that's what God's ultimate sign is. That's what God's ultimate promise is. That's what his ultimate signature is. Taking something that's dead and raising it back to life. And it's any situation that you find yourself in. Is your relationship dying? Well, God's promise, God's signature is to raise that back to life. Do you think your grades are dead? Well, it's God's promise. It's God's signature to raise that back to life. And all he's saying is believe in me. All he's saying is accept the love that I have for you. Live it out. Live it out. So going a little bit deeper, I was just talking about a sign. Well, you know, there's a word for that in Hebrew as well. And it's at, or oth, or outh, depending on what source you use. But it's spelt aleph, vav, tav. And it shows up a lot of times in the Bible, over and over and over again. People are asking for God. They're asking God for a sign. They're asking God for a wonder or a miracle. And every single time, aleph, vav, tav, at, that's the word being used. One of the last times it's ever used in the Bible actually comes in Isaiah chapter 66. God is speaking to us through his prophet Isaiah, and he says that he will gather all of the nations, and he will perform a sign among them. And those who survive will go forth and be messengers. Those who survive. We've got to focus on that for a little bit because it's a little bit odd. But it's sort of reminiscent of what's going on in Ezekiel. Those who survive. Man, in Ezekiel, God just ordered sort of like the condemnation of the entire city of Jerusalem. And one of the commands that he gives to those 6 men with weapons is to defile the temple. Start their killing in the temple. Anyone who doesn't have the tav on their forehead, kill them. And the specific word that God uses, he says, defile the temple, because he's not there. He's not there anymore. Actually, in the vision, it describes the presence of God leaving the temple. And he says, defile the temple, as if it could be defiled any further from what the people have already done there. Jumping back to Isaiah 66, those who survive will be messengers to the nations. Survive is a really strange word. So I looked it up, and it's to live in spite of danger, to live in spite of destruction, to live in spite of harm. And if you think about it, that's sort of exactly what happened. I live in spite of the sin, in spite of the destruction that I'm owed, in spite of the danger that is put on my life, in spite of the danger the world throws at me. God's promise, God's sign, God's signature, God's seal is that I would have life instead. The word used here in Hebrew is actually a conjugated form of the word pelet. And pelet, actually, if you look into the description of what that word means, it actually means deliver or delivered or saved. And so what Isaiah 66 is saying is, God is going to perform a sign, Aleph, Vav, Tav, At. And those who are delivered, and those who are saved, and those who will live in spite of the destruction, in spite of the danger, in spite of the sin that's going on, those who live, those who are redeemed, you're going to go out and you're going to be messengers to all nations. You're going to be messengers to all nations. A lot of people spend their time asking for a sign to come, asking, God, show me a sign, and maybe I'll believe. God, show me that I'm doing the right thing. God, I need a sign. And you're not alone. The Bible's filled with people who have asked exactly that of God. But what I'm going to tell you right now is that the sign has already come. And God's already given you instructions. Aleph, Vav, Tav, At means sign. Aleph, it's a picture of an ox's head. But like I was saying, you could spell letters in Hebrew using other letters. And the way that you spell Aleph is actually Aleph, Lamed, Pei. First two letters, Aleph, Lamed. That's actually how you spell God. I'll show you why. Lamed is a picture of a shepherd's staff, and it means authority, to teach. Aleph, a picture of an ox's head, and it means strength, leader, first. And so we have El, the strong leader. We have El, the powerful teacher. We have El, the strong shepherd. And it's the same exact thing. It's the same exact El that's used in words like El Shaddai, or Elohim, God Almighty, or Emmanuel, God with us. That El means God in Hebrew. And then we have Pei, which is a picture of a mouth, just to round out how you spell this letter Aleph. God speaks. Now, Aleph is actually sort of a silent letter. I don't know how else to put this, because we go throughout the Bible and we see that, God's voice, it's not in the earthquake, it's not in the fire, it's not in the tornado, it's in the still small voice. That still small voice, Aleph, God speaks, the silent letter. It might be a silent letter, but it has the power to change everything. It might be a silent letter, but it completely flips everything. It changes the fundamentals of the word. Here's another extra credit section, but just to point out what I'm telling you. Death in Hebrew, or to die in Hebrew, met, mem, tav, the promise of chaos. Truth in Hebrew, emet, aleph, mem, tav, one letter. One letter has the power to change death into truth. Because the truth is that without God, there's only death. Or the other way to look at it, that what these two words are telling us, the truth is that God has overcome death. But we see again that in the word sign, Aleph, Vav, Tav. Aleph can also have these connotations of God. And so the picture behind this word for sign, the picture behind this word for miracle, for miraculous wonder, the picture that's used in Isaiah when God says, I'm going to gather the nations together and I'm going to perform a sign in front of them. And it's the sign that's going to save people. The picture behind this word that's used, Aleph, Vav, Tav, is God nailed to the cross. That's the sign. That's the sign that we've already been given. That's the sign that has existed, that we've been looking for since the time of Isaiah, about 600 BC, I think. 400 years-ish later, that sign has come. And now it's 2,000 years after that sign has come that we exist today with that same exact promise of salvation. with that same exact promise to bring death back into life, to clean us up, to meet us where we are, despite our sin, despite everything that the world is throwing at us, and to transform us. Because that is God's signature, the Tav, the cross.